The most sadistic Vault-Tec experiments explained. Fallout has a lot of obvious monsters. Raiders will shoot you for a bottle cap. Super mutants will drag people into ruined buildings. Deathclaws are basically walking nightmares with claws. And depending on who you side with, groups like the Enclave, the Institute, or even the Brotherhood of Steel can easily become villains in their own way. But the scariest villain in Fallout might not be the one waiting for you in the wasteland. It might be the company that smiled before the bombs fell, handed people a clean blue jumpsuit, and told them they were being saved. That is Vault-Tec, and Vault-Tec didn't sell survival. Underground shelters, sealed doors, medical supplies, food, water, order, and a future for humanity after nuclear war. But as you dig deeper into the vaults, you realize something much darker. A lot of these places were never really built to protect anyone. They were built to test people. So today, we're looking at the most sadistic Vault-Tec experiments in Fallout. Not just the weirdest vaults or the most famous ones, but the experiments where the cruelty feels deliberate. Because once that vault door closed, the people inside were no longer citizens, families, or survivors. To Vault-Tec, they were data, Vault-Tec's real purpose. Before we get into the individual vaults, we have to talk about the real trick behind Vault-Tec. On the surface, this company did not look like a villain. It looked like the most responsible corporation in America. Vault-Tec had the smiling mascot, the bright blue and yellow branding, the clean propaganda posters, the friendly sales pitch, and the promise that if the worst day in human history ever came, they would be ready. They sold the idea of safety at a time when everyone could feel the world getting closer to collapse. Nuclear war was not just some distant fear anymore. It was something people were preparing for, buying into, and trying to survive. Adding to it, the vaults were part of Project Safehouse, a government-backed program meant to create sealed fallout shelters for selected members of the population. The public idea was simple. If the bombs dropped, people would go underground, survive the radiation, and eventually return to rebuild America. But Fallout lore makes it clear that, outside a minority of control vaults, many of these shelters had a much darker purpose. They were designed as controlled experiments on the people inside. That is what separates Vault-Tec from most villains in the wasteland. Raiders are obvious. Super mutants are obvious. Even the Enclave is usually pretty direct about what it wants. But Vault-Tec's evil was hidden behind procedure. It came with contracts, overseer manuals, monitoring systems, emergency protocols, and corporate language that made human suffering sound like research. The vaults were perfect laboratories because they removed every normal protection a person might have. Once the door closed, there was no outside law, no independent witness, no escape route, no press, no court, and no government agency coming to check if the residents were okay. The people inside were trapped with whatever conditions Vault-Tec had designed for them. And that is where the horror really starts. A normal shelter is built around protection, but Vault-Tec's experimental vaults were built around variables. The people inside did not know they were test subjects. They thought they were survivors. They thought they were lucky. They did not just take advantage of the apocalypse after it happened. They planned for it as an opportunity. A chance to seal thousands of people underground and see what broke first, the body, the mind, or the society around them. Vault 11. Picture the cleanest version of democracy possible. A sealed community, limited population, everyone knows each other, every vote matters, and every election has consequences. Now imagine that the consequence is execution. That is Vault 11. And honestly, it might be one of the most disturbing vaults in the entire Fallout series because it does not need monsters, radiation, chems, or mutants to become horrifying. The experiment only needed one command: and a group of terrified people trapped underground with no way out. Vault 11 appears in Fallout, New Vegas, located in the Mojave Wasteland. Like many vaults, it was not designed as a normal shelter. After the blast doors sealed, the residents were told by the vault computer that they had to sacrifice one person every year. If they refused, everyone in the vault would supposedly be killed. So already, this is a nightmare. But the real cruelty is that the entire instruction was a lie. If the residents had refused to sacrifice anyone, Vault-Tec's system would have congratulated them for valuing human life and allowed the vault door to open with the Overseer's permission. So the test was not really about sacrifice, it was about obedience. Vault-Tec wanted to know if people would continue doing something evil just because an authority system told them it was necessary. And they did. The residents believed the threat, so they created a system to choose the sacrifice. Eventually, that system became an election. Whoever was elected overseer would serve their term, enter the sacrificial chamber, and die. That one detail turns the whole idea of leadership upside down. In most societies, people campaign to gain power. In Vault 11, people campaigned to avoid it. Posters, voting blocks, political attacks, and smear campaigns filled the vault, but the goal was not to win. The goal was to make sure someone else lost. Different factions formed, including groups like the Justice Bloc, Human Dignity Bloc, Divine Will Bloc, and others, all fighting to control who would be nominated next. And that is where the experiment becomes even darker. Vault-Tec did not just create a death chamber, it created a political culture where survival depended on pushing death onto someone else. Over time, the system became corrupt, violent, and deeply personal. The story of Catherine Stone shows just how ugly it became. Members of the powerful Justice Bloc threatened to nominate her husband, Nathan, unless she submitted to them. Then they betrayed her anyway and nominated him. Catherine responded by murdering members of the bloc, which made her the likely next overseer and saved her husband from being chosen. After becoming overseer, she ended the election system and replaced it with a random selection process, which helped trigger a violent coup that killed nearly everyone left in the vault. So by the time the final survivors finally refused to continue, it was already too late. Only 5 people remained. They walked into the sacrificial chamber, rejected the command, and only then learned the truth. No one ever had to die. The system had been waiting all along for them to say no. And that is why Vault 11 is so sadistic. Vault-Tec did not force people to kill each other directly. It made them believe murder was civic duty. It turned fear into government, voting into execution, and democracy into a machine that selected one body at a time. Vault 11 was not asking whether people could survive underground. It was asking how long morality would last when authority told people it had to die first. Vault 75. A school is supposed to be one of the last places where a child still gets to be a child. Classrooms, lockers, lunch tables, gym floors, bad drawings on the wall, names carved into desks, that kind of thing. Even in Fallout, where almost everything is broken, a school still carries that old feeling. It is supposed to be a place for learning, not selection. For growth, not experiments. And then there is Malden Middle School. Underneath that school in Fallout 4 is Vault 75, and once you understand what it was built for, it becomes one of the coldest Vault-Tec experiments in the entire series. On the surface, it was presented as a safe place for students and their families to survive nuclear war. The kind of place parents would run toward when the sirens started. The kind of place that sounded like rescue. But according to the Vault's own terminal logs, its true purpose was the refinement of human genetics, using selective breeding, genetic modification, and hormonal treatments. So already, the lie is calculated. These families were not entering a shelter. They were walking into a selection program. When the bombs fell, families connected to the school made it into the vault. But the adults were not part of the future Vault-Tec wanted to study, so they were removed from the equation. Children were separated from their parents, and the adults were killed under the false explanation that they were being taken for orientation. From that point on, the vault belonged to the experiment. No parents, no outside world, and no normal childhood. Just training, testing, and control. The children were raised under a system that looked like education, but was really conditioning. They were pushed physically and mentally, judged constantly, and taught about the horrors of the surface world, sometimes called up-to-planned. The idea was that one day, the best of them would be strong enough to go outside and help the suffering people above. And that is what makes the manipulation so cruel. Vault-Tec did not just scare these kids. It gave them a heroic lie and told them their pain had a purpose. But graduation in Vault 75 was not really graduation. It was sorting. The strongest and most intelligent children were useful. Some could be harvested for their genes. Some who showed enough intelligence and obedience could be recruited into the science team. Others who did not meet the standard were eliminated when they reached adulthood. Terminal notes also imply that even the successful graduates were not truly safe, because the entire point was preserving and extracting what the Vault considered valuable. That is the part that makes Vault 75 so nasty. It treats childhood like raw material. A child is not a person in this system. A child is a possible soldier, possible donor, possible researcher, or failed product. By the time the sole survivor finds the place in 2287, the original experiment is long over, and the vault has become a gunner stronghold. But the rooms still tell you what happened. Training areas, combat simulations, terminals, security sections, all hidden under a middle school. Even companion dialogue points out how wrong the place feels, with characters recognizing it as some kind of training ground or wondering if Vault-Tec was building a private army. And that is why Vault 75 stands out. It is not just another vault where people died. It is a vault where Vault-Tec tried to redesign what a person could become, starting with children too young to resist. Vault 75 did not just steal lives. It stole childhood first, Vault 87 and Vault 12. Some Vault-Tec experiments attacked society, some attacked memory, some attacked trust. But Vault 87 and Vault 12 are different because these two vaults went directly after the body itself. Not beliefs, not politics, not addiction, just the body. Vault 87 from Fallout 3 is one of the most important vaults in the Capital Wasteland because it explains where many of that region's super mutants came from. It was located northwest of Little Lamplight, and by 2277, it had become the main stronghold and birthplace of the super mutants and centaurs that terrorized the DC ruins. But the reason they exist is not some random wasteland accident. Vault 87 was converted into a research center for the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV. Around 2076, its original social experiment was scrapped, and it became part of the Evolutionary Experimentation Program under Dr. Wayne Merrick and his staff. That detail matters because FEV is one of the most destructive forces in Fallout lore. It was not just a disease, it was a complete rewrite of the human body. In Vault 87, test subjects were exposed to it and began changing. Their bodies became stronger, their skin became thicker and more resilient, but the mental effects were severe. The project records describe increased anxiety, rage, brain damage, failed subjects, and terminations after the mutation process became uncontrollable. And then, like most Vault-Tec disasters, containment failed. About a year after the vault was sealed, mutated test subjects broke free and overwhelmed the security forces. The remaining vault dwellers were either driven out or exposed to FEV themselves. That is how Vault 87 became the source of a new generation of East Coast super mutants. After escaping, those mutants spread across the capital wasteland and began kidnapping humans to bring them back to the vault for more exposure. This cycle continued for nearly 200 years. That is what makes Vault 87 so horrifying. The victims were not just killed, they were transformed into the beginning of another catastrophe. Vault-Tec's experiment did not end when the scientists lost control. It kept moving through the wasteland in the form of every person dragged back to Vault 87, every human dipped into FEV, and every new mutant created from the original failure. On the other side, Vault 12 is a quieter horror, but in some ways, it is even colder. This vault was built under Bakersfield, California, and it was advertised like a normal shelter, complete with advanced water purification and the usual Vault-Tec promises of preparedness. But its true purpose was to study the effects of radiation on the residents. To make sure that happened, Vault-Tec designed the vault door not to close properly. When the Great War began on October 23, 2077, people forced their way inside, thinking they were saving their families. The door worked exactly as designed. Radiation flooded in, the survivors suffered ghoulification, and by 2083, some of them left the shelter and founded Necropolis. So Vault 87 and Vault 12 are like two sides of the same nightmare. One used a virus to force evolution. The other used radiation to watch people change slowly over time. And in both cases, survival was not mercy. Survival was the experiment continuing. Vault 95. There is a special kind of cruelty in giving someone hope just so you can measure what happens when you take it away. That is basically Vault 95. And compared to some other Vault-Tec experiments, this one does not begin with something obviously monstrous. No forced mutation, no radiation leak, and no yearly human sacrifice. At first, Vault 95 almost sounds like one of the few vaults that might have actually helped people. It was created as a rehabilitation facility for people suffering from chem addiction. In Fallout terms, that means people hooked on substances like Psycho, Jet, Buff-Out, Mentats, or whatever else the pre-war and post-war world could throw at them. So on paper, this vault was a recovery center. A clean environment with no access to chems, no outside dealers, and no old temptations. Just structure, meetings, rules, and other people trying to survive the same thing. The overseer position was even elected by the residents every year, and the overseer's job included running daily support meetings and making sure the residents followed the Vault-Tec rehabilitation program. And the disturbing part is, for a while, it actually worked. The residents progressed through the program for 5 years. Some still struggled with withdrawal, but the Vault's own records show the program helped people cope with their new lives. The planted Vault-Tec agent even noted that the experiment had been successful so far, and that when people had no other alternative, they could recover from addiction. That should have been the end of the test. But this is Vault-Tec, so of course, it was only the setup. 5 years after the vault was sealed, on October 23, 2082, the hidden agent planned to wait until the residents were asleep and open a secret stash of drugs. This stash had been placed there in advance. Chems, alcohol, and other addictive substances were hidden inside the vault, not by accident, not by raiders, not by some desperate resident, but by Vault-Tec itself. The next stage of the research was to see what would happen when the substances came back into the community. And that is what makes Vault 95 so sadistic. Vault-Tec did not simply test addiction, it tested relapse. It created a controlled recovery environment, allowed people to rebuild themselves, allowed them to form something close to a family, and then deliberately dropped temptation into the center of it. The company wanted to see if sobriety would survive when the old poison returned. The answer was tragic. The stash shattered the residents' bonds. Some gave in immediately. Others resisted for a while, but eventually used chems to cope with the violence and collapse happening around them. At least one resident realized the whole situation had been engineered and recorded anger over being deceived and exploited by Vault-Tec. By the time the sole survivor finds Vault 95 in Fallout 4, it is no longer a rehab facility. It is a gunner base near the glowing sea, full of traps, skeletons, and the leftovers of a recovery program that Vault-Tec intentionally destroyed. The hidden stash can still be found in the living quarters, with chems, alcohol, and skeletons scattered nearby like the experiment never really ended. And if you bring Kate there during her companion quest, the whole place becomes even darker. Kate is struggling with psycho addiction, and she believes Vault 95 may contain something that can help her. So the same vault designed to break recovering addicts becomes the place where one addict might finally get clean. That irony is brutal. Vault 95 proved recovery was possible, then Vault-Tec destroyed it just to see what would happen. Vault 106 and Vault 92. The body can be trapped pretty easily. Put someone underground, close a steel door, control the food, control the water, control the air, and eventually you control their life. But Vault-Tec did not stop there, because some Vault experiments were not satisfied with trapping people physically. They went after perception, memory, behavior, and sanity. They asked a darker question. What happens if a person cannot trust their own mind anymore? That is where Vault 106 comes in. Vault 106 appears in Fallout 3, and its experiment was almost invisible by design. The vault was built to hold 107 inhabitants, including 95 test subjects and 12 researchers. Its overseer, Dr. Albert Laris, came from Vault-Tec's Psychological Research Department. References to the experiment were kept under strict information control. 10 days after the vault was sealed, psychoactive drugs were released into the circulation system without warning the residents. Any strange effects were supposed to be dismissed as a filtration issue. That is terrifying, because the weapon was not a guard, a turret, or a disease. It was the air. The residents did not get to refuse the experiment. They did not even get to know it was happening. They breathed normally, and suddenly reality started to bend. Some dwellers entered relaxed hallucinogenic states. Others became erratic, unstable, and aggressive. The security chief eventually advised unaffected people to shelter in place. But at that point, the vault was already breaking from the inside. And the worst part is that the damage did not end with the original population. 2 centuries later, the drugs were still affecting travelers and scavengers who entered the vault. Fallout 3 even lets the player experience hallucinations inside Vault 106 because psychoactive agents still linger in the environment. So Vault 106 is not just a failed experiment. It is a psychological trap that kept working long after everyone who approved it was gone. Vault 92, on the other hand, is another kind of mental invasion, but this time the weapon was sound. At first, Vault 92 sounded almost noble. Vault-Tec invited some of the world's best musicians inside with the promise of preserving musical talent during the Great War. The vault was equipped with instruments, recording gear, and sound equipment, making it look like a cultural preservation project. But the real mission was White Noise Mind Suggestion Combat Experimentation, or WNMSCE. Once the vault was sealed on October 23, 2077, Overseer Richard Rubin began using modulated ultra-low frequency white noise to implant combat suggestions into human subjects. Think about how cruel that is. Vault-Tec selected musicians, people whose lives were built around sound, and then used sound to destroy them. The white noise was first tested in recording booths, but eventually it was wired into loudspeakers throughout the vault. Rubin even blocked personal sound players and headphones to keep residents exposed. The early tests seemed effective, with some subjects entering trance-like states and responding to suggestions. But then the side effects began: dizziness, nausea, loss of higher cognition, motor decline, aggression, and psychosis. One musician even murdered 3 dwellers and reportedly took nearly 23 gunshot wounds before being put down. Within a month, more violent incidents followed. Professor Malleus estimated that around 30% of the Vault population, nearly 70 people, had become clinically insane, with 35 dead. Even then, the experiment was not stopped early enough to save the Vault. Both experiments crossed the same line. Vault-Tec did not just imprison the body, it went inside the mind. Vault 112. Vault 112 does not look like one of the worst vaults at first. That is the trick. There are no piles of super mutant bodies near the entrance, no obvious radiation experiment, no children being trained under a school, and no election system built around sacrifice. Compared to some of the other vaults, Vault 112 is quiet, almost too quiet. You find it hidden beneath Smith Casey's garage in Fallout 3, and instead of a full underground society, you find rows of strange pods called Tranquility Loungers. The people inside are still alive, but their real lives ended a long time ago. The experiment was built around virtual reality. Residents were placed into the loungers and connected to simulated worlds, where they could live inside artificial environments instead of dealing with the horror outside. On paper, that almost sounds merciful. The surface is ruined, radiation is everywhere, civilization has collapsed, so maybe letting people live in a peaceful simulation is better than forcing them to wake up in a dead world. But that is not what happened. Vault 112 was controlled by Dr. Stanislaus Brown, one of Vault-Tec's most important scientists. He was not just some random overseer. Fallout lore connects him to major Vault-Tec research, including the development of the GECK. He served as the overseer and sole administrator of Vault 112, which meant the people inside were not living in a shared paradise. They were trapped inside one man's private experiment. And Braun got bored. That is where Vault 112 becomes horrifying. The residents did not know that once they entered the pods, they had no way to leave on their own. Braun had total control over the simulation. After growing tired of different virtual worlds, he started tormenting the residents. He would virtually kill them, wipe their memories, resurrect them inside the program, and then do it again. This cycle continued for around 200 years. That is a different kind of cruelty from most Vault experiments. In Vault 11, death was political. In Vault 87, death became a mutation. But in Vault 112, death became entertainment. It became repeatable. The version the lone wanderer enters is Tranquility Lane, a perfect little pre-war suburb that looks like it was pulled straight out of the 1950s. Clean houses, green lawns, cheerful neighbors, the whole fake American dream. But in the middle of it is Betty, a little girl who is actually Braun's avatar. And through Betty, Braun starts giving the player cruel tasks: break up a marriage, make a child cry, ruin people's lives, and eventually become the pint-sized slasher and murder everyone in the neighborhood. The residents do not fully understand what is happening. Most of them have had their memories wiped so many times that they accept the nightmare as normal. Only Old Lady Dithers seems aware that something is wrong. She knows the dream has become a prison, but she cannot escape it alone. That is why Vault 112 is so sadistic. It does not just trap the body, it traps identity. Vault 112 was supposed to preserve life. Instead, it proved that living forever can become hell when someone else owns the world you wake up in. Vault 81 and Vault 22. Not every Vault-Tec experiment begins with a cartoonishly evil idea. And honestly, that might make some of them worse. Because sometimes the pitch actually sounds useful. Cure disease, grow food, preserve life, and solve the kinds of problems that would matter even more after a nuclear war. On paper, that is the kind of science humanity would desperately need. But with Vault-Tec, the problem is almost never the goal. The problem is what they are willing to do to reach it. Vault 81 from Fallout 4 is a perfect example of that. When you first enter it, it does not feel like one of the nightmare vaults. It feels alive. There are residents, security, a doctor, a classroom, kids running around, people trading, and an overseer trying to keep things stable. Compared to places like Vault 11 or Vault 75, Vault 81 almost feels normal, and that is because the worst part of the experiment never fully happened. The original plan was hidden behind the walls. Secret Vault 81 was built as a disease research facility. The mole rats in the lab were used to grow new pathogens, and the plan was to expose Vault citizens to those viruses in the hope that they would develop new antibodies. But the scientists never got the chance to carry out the full plan because one mole rat, Clyde, escaped his cage, released the others, and the resulting outbreak killed the research team before the experiment could begin. So this is one of the rare moments where a vault survives because the experiment collapses before it can fully target the population. The regular residents of Vault 81 are still there in 2287 because the original overseer changed course and allowed the vault to serve its advertised purpose, an actual shelter in the event of nuclear attack. But the experiment does not disappear. It just sleeps under the floor. During the quest, Hole in the Wall, Austin Engel is bitten by an infected lab mole rat from the secret section. The disease is lethal for his immune system, and the sole survivor eventually finds Curie, who has spent decades working on a cure after the original scientists died. But there is only one unexpired dose. If the player is also infected, they have to choose whether to save themselves or give the cure to Austin. That is what makes Vault 81 so effective as horror. It shows how close helpful science can get to atrocity when consent disappears. On the other side, Vault 22 from Fallout, New Vegas takes that same idea and makes it greener, stranger, and more dangerous. Vault 22 was an agricultural research vault. Its floors were organized around systems like oxygen recycling, food production, and pest control. Again, the purpose sounds practical. In a post-war world, better crop growth and long-term food production could be the difference between rebuilding civilization and starving in the dirt. But one biological project became the vault's undoing. Beauveria mordicana, a fungus originally designed for pest control. It infected pests with spores, colonized their bodies, killed the host, and kept expanding through the corpse. The real disaster came when researchers learned the fungus could infect human bodies too. As experiments continued, spores gradually spread through the vault, infecting the population without them realizing it. Eventually, the infection took control of dead bodies and created aggressive spore carriers whose only purpose was to spread the spores further. So Vault 81 and Vault 22 are not the same kind of experiment, but they share the same moral rot. One used disease research, while the other used agricultural biology. Both began with science that could have helped people, but ended up doing the opposite. Vault 108 and Vault 111. Some vaults destroy people by making them fight. Some do it through radiation, disease, or addiction. But Vault 108 and Vault 111 are disturbing in a different way, because they attack something more personal than the body. They attack identity. Vault 108 from Fallout 3 is one of those places that feels funny for about 5 seconds, and then starts becoming extremely uncomfortable. Most people remember it for one reason: Gary. You walk through the vault, and all you hear is that same name repeated over and over again. Gary, Gary, Gary. At first, it feels like one of Fallout's weird jokes, and to be fair, it kind of is. But underneath the joke is a cloning experiment that went very wrong. Vault 108 was already strange before the clones took over. The overseer chosen for the vault, Brody Jones, had a genetic predisposition for a rare form of cancer, and researchers expected him to die only a few years after the project started. That means even the leadership structure was designed with instability in mind. Vault-Tec did not simply pick an overseer and hope he would guide the vault. They picked one whose death could become part of the experiment. But the most famous part is the cloning lab. Scientists in Vault 108 repeatedly cloned a man named Gary. Every time Gary was cloned, the clone immediately became hostile toward non-clones, and each new clone became more violent. Even after the 53rd clone, the results did not improve. By Gary 54, the aggression was still increasing, and one of the clones injured Dr. Peterson during an examination. Eventually, the staff discussed destroying some of the clones just to make room for more tests. And that is where the joke turns dark. Because Gary is not being treated like a person anymore. He is a biological pattern, a repeatable product, and a body that can be copied, observed, discarded, and copied again. The Vault turns one human identity into a loop, and by the time the lone wanderer finds the place, only Gary clones and creatures remain alive inside. Vault 111 from Fallout 4 does the opposite. Instead of copying identity again and again, it freezes it in place. This is the vault the sole survivor enters at the beginning of the game, overlooking Sanctuary Hills. On paper, it is a safe place. The bombs are falling, people are panicking, and Vault-Tec finally looks like the company that prepared for the end of the world. But the truth is that Vault 111 was designed to observe the effects of long-term cryonic stasis on unsuspecting test subjects. Residents from Sanctuary Hills and Concord were lured inside, given jumpsuits, and placed into pods after being told they were decontamination pods. That lie is what makes Vault 111 so cold. These people did not agree to become frozen research subjects. They thought they were going through emergency safety procedures. They thought they were surviving. Instead, they were paused. Families, neighbors, children, ordinary people who had just watched the world end were locked in pods and removed from time. And for the sole survivor, the horror becomes personal. They wake briefly to see their spouse murdered and their child taken, then get forced back into stasis. Everyone else becomes part of the background tragedy, still trapped in their pods, still waiting for a rescue that never comes. So Vault 108 and Vault 111 mirror each other in a really unsettling way. Vault 108 asks what happens when a person can be copied until individuality collapses. Vault 111 asks what happens when a person can be stored like equipment until the world decides they are useful again. Why Vault-Tec is Fallout's coldest villain. By the time you've gone through enough vaults, you start realizing something uncomfortable. Vault-Tec was not just one bad company that made a few unethical decisions. It was a system. A whole corporate machine built around smiling advertisements, government contracts, scientific language, and the quiet assumption that ordinary people could be used as test material. And that is what makes Vault-Tec feel colder than most villains in Fallout. Vault-Tec was different. Vault-Tec sold comfort, reassurance, and a promise. It gave families a number, a location, and a jumpsuit. But in many cases, the real danger is inside the vault itself. That is the pattern across almost every experiment we covered. And the thing tying all of this together is not just cruelty, it is consent. The point is, the residents did not know. They did not walk into these vaults as volunteers for psychological studies, biological trials, or moral stress tests. They walked in because the world was ending. And Vault-Tec used the single most desperate moment in human history as the perfect recruitment tool. They turned panic into participation. And even worse, the company understood presentation. The vaults were clean, the posters were friendly, and the language was safe. Everything about Vault-Tec was designed to make horror look official. A sacrifice became a protocol, a child soldier program became genetic refinement, A relapse trap became addiction research, and a frozen tomb became cryogenic preservation. That is the real evil here. Not just killing people, but making their suffering sound useful. Fallout has plenty of villains who destroy lives with weapons, but Vault-Tec destroyed lives with paperwork, with sealed doors, and with experiments approved before the victims even knew they were victims. And that is why the Vault still feels so unsettling long after you leave them. Because the horror was never just the bodies, the broken terminals, or the experiments buried in old security logs. It was the realization that these people ran towards safety and ended up inside something designed to study them. It is proof that the company's real legacy was not preservation. It was control. So now the question is yours. Which Vault-Tec experiment do you think was the most disturbing? And what Fallout topic should we break down next? If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more Fallout lore, dark experiments, and wasteland secrets.